Hi everyone. Okay, like always, the house is quiet, and the minute I sit down to start recording these two, it's like playtime, you know. Okay, so this is the lecture for sociobiology. So I just wanted to kind of go over the syllabus real quick, just because we're getting to towards the end of the semester, and I just want to make sure that you guys are clear on a few things. So one, I know I posted a reminder, an announcement, last week about this, that your papers are due on the 25th. So I'm recording this video on the 22nd. You might not be watching it until the 25th or the 24th or 26th. So hopefully, if it's before that 25th, you've managed your time well to turn it in on time. If you are watching this after the 25th and you're like, oh my God, I totally forgot. I've mentioned this multiple times before, turning stuff in late is, even if it's, 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 days late, is still better than taking a 0 for it. So, please do that. What was I going to say? Oh yeah, so a handful of you have reached out to me asking for clarification on a few things, which is, great. It shows me that you are all working on it. So I had posted that video on our Canvas page, I don't know, probably 3 weeks ago. Actually, it's probably in the syllabus when I did it. 10/21 was when I had it scheduled to do. So that's been up for a month now. I go over the requirements for the paper, and I let you guys know you can pick any topic that either we have already talked about or we will talk about. So if, for example, you started working on the paper last month, but we hadn't started talking about Neanderthals or something, you could have written the paper on that, as long as it's something we cover in the class. So if it's a topic you have found in your textbook or you see on the syllabus, then it's fine. You don't need to email me and ask me if your topic's okay. I'm going to trust you guys on that. If you are thinking of a topic and you're not sure if it's related to the class, maybe it's kind of peripheral, or maybe I mentioned it, in passing about something we didn't really talk about it, and you still want to write about it, then you should probably email me to make sure. But if it's something that's clearly we have I've lectured on, then it's fine. The other thing is, well, I was just gonna say, just watch the video that I posted before I go over all of the requirements, and there's also the paper in files that shows the document in files that it's called paper guidelines or something like that. And basically that short video I made, I just go over those in detail. But if you didn't watch the video and you looked at the paper, it's the same thing. So, but obviously if you have any questions, please reach out. The assignment itself is not very hard. You only need 5 sources for the research paper. You can pick any topic. So hopefully you pick something that you enjoy. It's not very long, so I think I mentioned this to you. I think I might have even mentioned this in that video, that I know some of my colleagues have required a 10-page paper from even the intro students. So I'm not requiring that. It's much shorter, but still don't procrastinate. If you haven't and like I said, if you have any questions, please reach out to me. I don't want to spend too much time on that. I want to get into the video, but just as a reminder that is due. Let's see the other thing. So this particular topic, when I've taught this in the past, because we're in class and we have that class discussion and it's a little more interaction, typically this takes me about 2 days to go through. Now if you're looking at the PowerPoint, it's only 14 slides. It's not very long, but like I said, typically there's a lot of discussion. So we don't have that interaction because I'm just recording it. But I still try to, obviously remember things other students have asked me in the past, and elaborate on a lot of what I've written down, or that's in the PowerPoint. So depending on how much I ramble, this might be 1 video, it might be 2. Now in the syllabus, I have it marked down that we're going to do sociobiology, part 1 on the 25th and part 2 on December 2nd. Now if I happen to just kind of go through this quickly and the video is not very long and it's just 1, then that means you get a little extra time, 1 less thing you have, 1 fewer thing you have to do on the 2nd. So that could be positive for you. But as I start talking, obviously we're already 5 minutes into this video and haven't even started the lecture yet. So as I get into it a little more, we might see, if it's going to be 1 or 2, but just as a heads up on that. Okay, so the other thing, let's see, on the 2nd, you also have the last article review, and this is what I wanted to make clear. So it's your last article review. However, this one is 2 articles together. It's 2, and they're 2 really short articles. One's a response to the other, and it's about sociobiology. It's about what we're talking about here. This topic is, we could have a whole class on just this topic. In fact, I, at the graduate level, have taken a whole seminar where we talked about sociobiology for the majority of the semester. So it's very, complex and intricate. But so just so you're clear, and it says that on the syllabus, it says do article review 4 against sociobiology and for sociobiology. So there's are 2 separate articles, and like I said, one is a response to the other. So make sure and it doesn't have to be twice as long. The assignment's still the same assignment. The same assignment that it's always been. The same, requirements for length and all that. It's all the same. So, and like I said, it's 2 shorter articles. So, but just make sure you read both. And then your last discussion prompt is also due on the 2nd. And then then there's the the final exam on the 9th. So just like before, I'll post that so many days beforehand. And so wrapping it up, you guys in general have been a great class. I know we don't have that interaction that I think probably most of us probably want in terms of like being in class together. But otherwise, I've had fun recording these videos. You guys seem to be watching them. And the feedback that I do get from you is great, and the quality of your work as a class is absolutely great. So that's always good to see, especially for a science class. Okay, so now that I've talked about this for a while, let's get into sociobiology. Okay, so we're starting on slide 2. So this might be something that you have heard of before, although I wouldn't be surprised if you haven't. So this whole thing, sociobiology, it kind of officially started back in the 1970s and you'll see that on the slide, this book. It was a book called Sociobiology, written by E.O. Wilson. And it's not as if he was the first person to kind of talk about these ideas, but it was the first time there was this like synthesized, literary work on this with a lot of research to back it up. So basically, and I'll preface it with saying the majority of the work in the book is about non-human animals, but there is some stuff about humans as well. It's basically looking at all of animals, and the whole point of this was looking at animal behavior and like the evolutionary reasons for animal behavior. I'm sorry, I'm distracted. My dog's like, she's got the snotty nose again. You okay? Okay. She's just chilling right there. Okay. So most of it was focused on non-human animals, but there was still some focus on humans. And of course, the humans who are reading it after were like, oh, clearly we have to extrapolate all this to humans because, humans are primates, we're mammals, we're animals. And people got really upset about this. And so kind of back it up a little bit more with imagine, for a long time now, like Darwin's, like 100 years before this, and there's been a lot of research, whether it's like on human evolution or biology, like evolution of all life, that there's been, decades and decades of amazing research looking at all these anatomical, physiological, morphological changes that have happened in different, species, different lineages, and, great science, great research happening. No one really had a problem at this time saying, oh yes, clearly we have evolved, to be bipedal, or that species evolved to swing from branches, or that species evolved to swim in the water. Like that species evolved, this length of a trunk, or this length of a neck, or this specific limb proportion, or whatever the physical feature was. Like this was like not an issue anymore, and so much like millions of studies, supporting all of this in understanding evolution throughout all of nature, plants and animals. So this was like not a big deal. However, when like evolutionary researchers were starting to think about some other questions, like, okay, well, as I got a tangle, we don't have a problem talking about the physical, morphological features that have evolved over time, whether it's in our lineage or another lineage, that's not an issue. The brain is also part of, the body. It's just another organ. More complex, we would probably say. Probably we know less about the brain, even now in 2020, we probably know less about the brain than other organs. That's probably a generally true statement. But these researchers, thought, well, we can look at the evolution of, the anatomy and physiology and morphology. Why aren't we looking at the evolution of behavior? And like now when we talk about it in 2020, it's like, oh yeah, of course, because you could take an intro to psych course, and there's probably I remember taking this years ago, an intro to psychology, like for my general ed. And there was a whole section on like evolution and how like that has affected our behavior in some interesting ways. Now, And then, of course, for the psychology department, there were other explanations. In anthropology, we would say evolution is the only, pretty much, well, not the only, but pretty much like the dominant factor in our behavior. And this is probably not a surprise to you. However, at the time, in the 1970s, this was highly controversial. This idea that individuals, especially because of course they have to bring in their own bias. Like, okay, yeah, sure, this can be true for other animals, but for humans, it just can't possibly be true. So they had their own bias about it. But basically, they had this problem with saying that there is somehow an evolutionary reason why you do the things that you do, whatever it is, choosing a mate, having offspring, not having offspring. So like those larger things, but also even the smaller things like what car you drive, what food you eat, even those daily choices you make, let alone like the larger life choices you might make in terms of like mates or offspring or anything like that. The things we really think are evolutionary choices, but to think that we're not really in control of that there's an evolutionary adaptation, like psychologically, either conscious or subconscious, that's occurring, that has been a process through time, that we actually don't really have even free will to an extent if you take this argument all the way. And so you can imagine, like, I'm really, really trying to simplify this idea, but it's very complex. And a lot of the research in this book was looking at social behavior between, a lot of it was insects, but a lot of it was mammals, like I said, and looking at social behavior specifically, but extrapolating that to other things. And of course, when you're looking at just humans, you can extrapolate that to like basically any decision that we're making, because the majority of decisions we're making are somehow social in some way. So as you can imagine, people were like, whoa, no, I don't have a problem with understanding that we're bipedal, but I definitely am the one making my decisions. Like, that's me, I'm making those decisions. And other people on the other side of this would say, well, no, you're probably not. It's probably an evolutionary process. Like, you chose that mate for very specific, I can't say that word, specific reasons. You decided to have kids or not have kids, or a certain number of kids for very specific evolutionary reasons. You're not conscious of them, but they are definitely happening. The choices you're making in different social scenarios are definitely influenced by that psychological adaptation, whatever it is. And there's probably many, and they're probably very integrated with each other. And also it's going to be informed by your personal life experience, which of course is like the environment of that adaptation. So think about when we talked about sexual selection, non-random mating, that we already know that a lot of that stuff, and we talked about it in kind of general terms, but a lot of the choices you're making in terms of mates, like a lot of that's subconscious. Like that's not really you making those choices. I mean, you are sort of, but not really, if that makes sense to you. So like I said, you can imagine why people were very, up in arms about this, and there was so much debate, and people were like fighting. And this is one of the great things about, well, I think one of the great things about in academia, you can go back, and I've only given you 2, which is per like that assignment where you have those 2 articles. But literally at this time for like a decade, it was just someone would write an article and someone would respond to that article, and someone would respond to them, and someone would respond to the first one, and there would be another response. And the way you have to be like professional when presenting, your work to a academic journal, but still somehow, and you'll notice sometimes, not so much in the ones I assigned to you, but in other ones where there are like underhanded jabs at the other person, so like it's kind of comical in a sense, but it's also good to see like that back and forth, and which is a great thing about science and academia, that even if you're like, I absolutely disagree with your side, that there can be that back and forth. This side can present evidence, this side can present evidence, and that's how we move forward in science. So that's always great. But anyway, so this is very controversial at the time. Okay, so go to slide 3. I might have kind of rambled and said some of the stuff I already have here, but we'll just kind of go through these. Okay, so slide 3, so sociobiology. So like, what was it really about? So the book covered, you could see these bullet points, reproductive strategies, like I already mentioned, the choices you're making in terms of like mates, social behavior. So like your relationships and behaviors toward your parents, towards siblings, towards other extended family. There's actually a lot of really great research into this. Looking at how we interact with family members, time we invest, energy, resources we invest or don't invest, depending on the environment, depending on the cultural experience. So it's really interesting. Also, that stuff, some stuff that was covered: aggressive displays, threat displays, affiliative behavior. So affiliative behavior is like, what's the word I'm thinking of? I'm completely blanking. There was a very specific word I want to use and I can't think of it, but I'll just describe to you. So like the behaviors you have typically towards people in your own family that allow you to bond with them. So it could be physical things like hugging or cuddling, or we see like in other primates where they might groom each other. So stuff, there's a very specific anthropological term that I'm blanking on. We use affiliative, but there's another one too. Anyway, you guys know what I'm talking about. So like those type of behaviors that allow you to bond, like with offspring or with, you know, siblings or with parents. Hey baby, with your dogs, you know, oh baby. And then it talked about this idea of kin selection. So I think I have a slide to explain kin selection to you very specifically. Okay, so the next slide. So go to the next slide if you're thinking, what is kin selection? So we talked before about, you know, reproductive success, like early when we're talking about evolution, this idea and like and individual fitness, that you like fitness is a description of how many like simplified, it's how many offspring you have. You are more or less fit than someone else if you have more offspring than them, because you are, you know, passing your genes into the next generation more so or less so than the other people. So that's like the whole point of obviously of the continuing of the genetics in terms of evolution. So we talked about that before, but thinking in terms of like, it's not always about your individual fitness. It can be about what we call inclusive fitness. And I think I have that. Okay, that's a bullet point. That you obviously share genetic information with your offspring. If you have offspring, obviously they have your genes. But you also share genes with other people in that next generation, even if you don't have offspring. And typically we reference nieces and nephews. So say you don't have any kids, but say you have a sister and she has, let's say, 2 kids. You don't share the same amount with them that you would share with your own offspring, but you still share a decent amount with them. So in a sense, you're kind of indirectly passing down your genes because you and your sister share a lot of genetic information. So, and this is what I had focused my master's research on, was looking at this, that for oh my gosh, specifically, that's the third time I've stumbled over that word. Okay, specifically for females who chose not to have children, looking at how much time they were investing resources or time or energy or money into their nieces and nephews. And what I found was I had a small sample size. Well, I mean, it was sufficient for my small project, but basically the results were that for those females who chose not to have children, they invested way more time, energy, money, resources into their nieces and nephews than those who had children. And this is not a surprise to you, but like having the data, like, and looking at it statistically was like, okay, something else is interesting is going on. And like there was more to my research than that, but that was like kind of one of the main ideas. So basically this idea that you will still have behaviors that will benefit your family. They don't necessarily have to be, oh baby, what's wrong? You got the snotty nose? Goodness. You gotta do this right when I'm recording, huh? Okay. That they don't necessarily have to be your direct offspring. So you might have behavior, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself if I say this on the next slide. No, okay, I don't. Okay, so you might be willing to sacrifice a lot more like time or energy or resources for your offspring, like if you have them, or like maybe say like a sibling or a niece or nephew, probably more so than like a third cousin or a great aunt. Now your very specific individual scenario might be a little different. Maybe you were raised by your aunt or something like that, or you're really close, happen to be with like your 4th cousin, like that stuff happens. But generally, this is absolutely true, that we are absolutely more willing to invest and sacrifice things. There's a cost. We're willing to take on that cost in some way for those who are more closely related than those who are further out. And definitely more so, you're more willing to invest in people you're more like closely related to than perfect strangers. So, but also on this slide, look at this thing, the last bullet point. I'm stumbling over words this whole time. Altruism. because this is always the thing, well, how can you explain that people do good things for strangers? How can you explain people volunteering and doing charity work? Now we could talk about it from a cultural or, individual or religious perspective, that of course, we want to see people do well. We want to help people. This is like a hallmark of humanity that we do this. I'm probably more pessimistic in like pretty much, I think there's always an evolutionary explanation for pretty much everything. And so looking at this from an evolutionary perspective, it's not that hard to figure out. And I've kind of written it here, or typed it on the bullet points for you to see. So you are more likely to be altruistic or to be like selfless or giving to people who you're more closely related to. That's like a given. Like we already know that based on the research. But also, I thought I typed this one part, but I guess I didn't. But also, so I'll just say it right now. Also, when we look at, and this is always important to look at how we have evolved, and I am pretty sure I mentioned this to you guys before, that population size is an often overlooked factor in so many things going on evolutionarily in our species, that we evolved in small groups. We are used to being in small groups, around 30 to 50 people. That's how, like, all the adaptations we have, even now, like, that's from the past. Like, some of that stuff, like, we're kind of moving ahead and the adaptations haven't really caught up a little bit, if that makes sense to you. And so we have all these, like, mental and psychological mechanisms for living in small groups, like social mechanisms for living in small groups. So if it's assumed that everyone in your group, because there's only 50 of you, the majority of them are probably related to you to some degree. It makes sense that we've kind of extrapolated that into like modern times, that we still do things for people in our community, even though they're not technically blood related. I hope like that idea makes sense to you. So we can often explain, and also like even at the other end of it, there's always a benefit to you. Nothing's ever completely selfless. Like when you volunteer, you still like have a sense that you're doing something good. You feel good about yourself, that you're giving back to the community or something like that. So, even in that sense, that you are still getting a benefit from it. So it's never 100% like, selfless. Okay, go to slide 5. Are you done? Can I not pet you this whole time? Okay. She's like, you gotta pet me the whole time you're lecturing. She's like nudging me, baby. It's not the time. You're so spoiled. Okay. Go to slide 5, kin selection. So talking about this idea of kin selection, do not confuse kin selection with what is known as group selection. I will say this, group selection is a flawed model, and I've put that up there. This is very clear. Now you may be thinking, I don't even know what group selection is. I barely just learned what kin selection is. Now I gotta know what it's not. Just in case, because I've heard people say this, people who aren't necessarily even really familiar with a lot of anthropology, that they have still heard about group selection. People try to make, per my meme that I created, people try to make group selection work. It doesn't freaking work. It doesn't make sense the way people want it to make sense, and the research does not support it at all. So often this idea of group selection is that, and like I said, it's a flawed model, because even the way they've set it up to kind of be analogous to natural selection, the analogy is flawed from the get-go. But basically, people who are proponents of this, with no research data to back it up, people are still proponents of this, basically think that there is somehow innately in different species a need to sacrifice for the group or the species, and that you are willing to make sacrifices that will benefit humanity as a whole. And when you actually look at, there's no data to back this up, and it just doesn't work. And especially when you get into, if you were curious, you could look into some of the research that those who have tried to kind of make group selection as analogous to natural selection doesn't work, because then the model has to be set up to where there are so many groups that compete with each other. There's a really great, probably none of you are, but if you are interested, there is a great article written by Steven Pinker on this, and you could just Google it right now. It's called, now I'm gonna blank. Okay, I'll Google it right now, because I wanna, let's see. It's Steven Pinker, I remember that part. Baby, I can't pet you right now. Wait, I think I remembered it in my head, but I'm gonna see if it's the right thing. I don't wanna say it the wrong way. Steven Pinker, group selection. I knew it, okay. The false allure of group selection. So if you were interested in just knowing a little bit more about that, I'm not going to ask you about it on the exam, but if you happen to be interested or you've heard some stuff, you're like, I want to know what it's about. So it's a really great short article you can read, probably taking you like 10 minutes or something. And he really goes into why it's flawed and some of the great details about it. Anyway, but I kind of briefly explained it to you. This is not the same thing as kin selection. Kin selection very specifically, and if you go to slide 6, you'll see this has this is a very simplified, for the purposes of this course, a mathematical model to show you. Basically, when we're looking at kin selection, it's very specifically about the behaviors you do, the sacrifices you make, the cost you're willing to incur on yourself for other people, because there is an evolutionary benefit in the outcome. So typically what we see is you are going to sacrifice or make sacrifices in some way for those who are closely related to you. Typically it's your offspring, because the cost associated with it is the benefits will outweigh, basically the benefits will outweigh the cost. If you need to, die in some, scenario for your children to live, we want to say, we would say, oh, it's because, you love your kids. And while that's true, there is something else going on evolutionarily. Of course you're willing to sacrifice, because in terms of, passing on your genetic information, that's the sacrifice. You have passed them on. You need to keep that going so that you can basically die, because that event has already occurred. And like I said, the further out someone is related to you, the less likely you'll be willing to make those larger sacrifices. Goodness. Okay, and you can kind of see here it's set up. It's called Hamilton's rule, and it's looking at relatedness between the person doing whatever the altruistic behavior is, and then the person receiving the benefits of that behavior. What is the benefit and what is the cost? And so you can see in general this is how it's calculated to see. Okay, I'm trying to think why, because I do want to make this too. I'm already out 30 minutes. I'm trying to decide where I want to make the cutoff. Okay, so I'll do this, I think, because this still goes with what I was saying. So let's go to slide 7. And this will be, I think I'll wrap it up. I think the split between slide 7 and 8 might be the perfect spot. Okay, so slide 7. A little bit more on sociobiology. So I kind of talked about why it was controversial, and I just want to kind of make sure that I touch on a few more things just to reiterate. Woo! Snotty. Baby, give me 1 second, guys. I think you guys can probably hear that in the background. Oh, baby, you okay? Oh, goodness. Okay. Okay. Almost done. Okay, baby. I know you're sicky. Okay. The human bias. So one, it's this argument okay, sure, other animals that affects them, penguins or chimpanzees or whatever, they don't really know why they're choosing a mate. It's just this evolutionary mental process. But for humans, we are special. It doesn't apply to us. And you will see renowned scientists saying this. And I get people don't want to take that in. Wait, I don't have free will to either a slight degree or at all. That's a hard thing to come to terms with. I absolutely believe it's accurate, and based on obviously the evolutionary process. But often it's humans are special is the argument, and they will outright say this often. They'll try to mask it in scientific or evolutionary terms, well, humans have evolved a more complex cognition, mentality, whatever it is, so we have somehow stepped outside of that problem. We can make the decisions, but in reality that's not accurate. And I know I mentioned this later. I don't want to get too far ahead. Okay, so I'm going to mention, I was going to say it now, but I'm going to say it in another slide, so I'll save it for part 2. Okay, but also I want to say this other thing right here. So it says biological determinism, which I'm going to cover on the next video, but just as a quick, foreshadowing. And this thing, brain-mind dualism. So this is really important idea that, because when we start talking about evolution of, psychological mechanisms, we're talking about the brain. And often there's this kind of philosophical, but also scientific question of, is the brain, or the brain and the mind the same thing, or are they different? And so if I asked you, like, where do you do your thinking, you would say, you might say your mind, you might say your brain. But if I ask you, like, do you feel like those two things are different? You might be split. You might say, well, okay, there's the brain processing stuff neurologically, but there's still kind of a higher level of something else that's going on that maybe we can't explain. And often people will kind of, what's the word? I am just blanking on words today. They will reference. They will reference. Oh my! I'm right at the end of the lecture. Surprise visitor. So they will often reference. We all got so scared. They will often reference even things like your spirit or your soul in some way that is somehow separate from the physical nature of who you are, like your brain even. So just know that there are no data to back that up, and it's just like chaos right now. And so I'll just cut it off now. That was pretty much the last of it. And like I said, we'll do part 2. We'll do that the week after, and I'll see you guys on the next one.